Me again, Jonathan Clements, in your audios, talking about your Gunbusters, here for the cold open of Episode 2, in which we get to see the Luxion fleet incident that was humanity's disastrous first contact with the alien enemy. You'll notice, I hope, that the ship design here has a certain retro quality, and indeed was intended by the designer to evoke a little of the submarines of Satoru Ozawa and the machineries of Shigeru Komatsuzaki, both figures from the 1950s and 1960s, when manga machines had much more retro quality. And Noriko's dad, of course, is conveniently wearing the same clothes that he had on in that photograph of him, and the young coach has, just a few moments ago, as we stand in episode 1, shown us his facial scar, so he's recognisable too. And I mention that because one of the crucial factors with the original reception of Gunbuster is that this was not a TV show where you had to wait a week for the next episode. It was released in 2-episode chunks, straight to video, which I suspect is one of the reasons the animators thought they could get away with such a lightweight opening episode, because they knew the viewers were a captive audience for the next. One such captive viewer, or rather reader, was Hideaki Anno himself, who's confessed in interviews that he was not all that interested in Gunbuster when he read the script for episode 1, but he truly fell in love with it when he read the script for episode 2, as it developed more serious story beats, like the melancholy sequence of the captain going down with his ship, telling his daughter's image he won't make it back in time for her birthday. And as we go into the opening credits, this leads me to note there is a reason for those flooded areas in Japan. Toshio Okada did say very publicly that the animators had deliberately drawn a map of Japan there, in which every single nuclear power plant was ominously flooded, as if after a bunch of accidents or sabotages. It's probably less obvious here because the one that everyone would be sure to recognise today, Fukushima, is actually hidden under the producers' names. You'll notice, I hope, that pretty much all the footage used in the title sequence derives from the first 2 episodes, as those were the only 2 that had been completed at the time the first volume was released. It's not unknown for Japanese animators to make some scenes out of order so they have some cool moments for the opening credits, but Gainax don't seem to have done that here. What this means is that for the Gunbuster series, at least in the early stages, we have this jaunty, happy tune set over images of humans and robots, with no real treatment of the actual enemy, the monster menace that we won't really encounter to any degree until episode 3. And we do get that little character setup in which Kimiko is incongruously inserted into the cast ensemble, despite having very little to do after episode 1. If some of the older nerds among you, by the way, are wondering why the shuttle we're going to see Noriko travelling in looks uncannily like the Fireflash atomic airliner in Thunderbirds, that is no coincidence at all. Hideaki Anno is a huge Thunderbirds fan and cannot resist the chance to throw it in. There was also an original intention for Gunbuster to have some sort of sponsorship deal with Japan Airlines, which helps explain why it has a genuine JAL logo on the shuttle, although I don't believe that sponsorship ever actually came through. Maybe now they've got a chance to stick it on in-flight entertainment now that this has all been tarted up for a new century. As we get our beauty pass of the Exelion under construction, by the way, do keep your eyes peeled for another visual gag around the 3-minute 54 mark. In what appears to be Studio Ghibli's Laputa, the castle in the sky, floating in front of it. Now, the characters are on their way. There it is. The characters are on their way to the space station Silver Star, which, according to the spin-offs, was originally a NASA space station called Atlanta, but was handed over to the Japanese Empire as some sort of war reparation and renamed the Silver Star after a similar looking site in the Japanese TV series Captain Ultra. Any similarity to the space station in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey is, I am assured, purely coincidental. And it's this episode as well that we are first introduced to the episode's titular girl genius, the wonderfully named Jung Freud, who takes her name from 2 of the world's most prominent psychologists. Her backstory is one of the things that really dates this show, of course, because Gunbuster takes place in a world where the Soviet Union did not collapse at the end of the 1980s, but remains a world power. In fact, it collapsed mere months after Gunbuster was released, the nightmare of any science fiction future historian. And we have this absolutely fantastic scene where Jung Freud and Big Sister throw shade at one another, in what is supposedly a perfectly innocent exchange of pleasantries, but is in fact loaded with icy menace, denoted here by the use of the chiming zooms onto the eyes that are more often used in anime for scenes of tension in combat. And this episode also introduces the character of Tatsumi Tashiro, whose name and indeed whose appearance derives from that of Tatsumi Ashiro, the audio director at Group TAC and a former director on space cruiser Yamato. And he's voiced by the late Tamio Oki, probably most recognisable to foreign viewers as the voice of Aramaki in Ghost in the Shell and Wart in Record of Lodoss War. And he is a man who had a lot of authoritarian roles in the Japanese dubbing world, and some of his Hollywood voices have included, over the years, the Emperor in The Empire Strikes Back, the Emperor in David Lynch's Dune, and Professor X in the Marvel X-Men movies, right up until his death in 2017. Now, Coach has already warned us that matters of scale can be different for the human mind to process in space, a fact alluded to already by the possibility that the Exelion is 100 times larger than Hayao Miyazaki's floating city of Laputa. And this idea of a constantly expanding scale, or distances, or traumas, or drama, even stakes expand in this, and that's something that's going to be a recurring theme in Gunbuster. We get a sense of it here as well, in Coach's offhand declaration that the cadets are going to race once around the moon and back, a journey which in our world should take a week, but which the characters here are going to treat like it's one lap around the high school racing track. But of course, if the stakes are the same as high school, then so is the likelihood there's bound to be some kind of bullying bad girl, which brings us back to the wonderful Young Freud. Now, she is voiced by Maria Kawamura, who first came to the attention of anime fandom at a notorious event in 1981 where there was almost a riot at the premiere of the Gundam movie. And she was one of the figures who appeared on stage, dressed in costume as one of the characters from Gundam, alongside her future husband, also in costume, the designer Mamoru Nagano. And she subsequently went on to become a voice actress, playing Irma in Zeta Gundam and Ifrita in El Hazard. But I think a lot of her importance to Gainax at the time was her role as a sort of fan ambassador between the old and new orders, notoriously dressed as Lala-san at the Gundam movie event and as Lum at an Urusei Yatsura commemorative event sometime afterwards. So she was really a quintessential case of a fan going pro, which was of course how most of Gainax also saw and continued to see themselves. So you can perhaps understand why she had such an appeal for them. She also has a particular penchant for playing icy, regal women, so it's great to have her voicing Young Freud as both a sneering rival and later on as a dear friend. And just to establish the way things are going to be for the next 2 hours, Young Freud shouts out the name of her attack as she does it, and this kind of ritualized act that ultimately derives from professional wrestling lent itself to many tropes and traditions at the sci-fi shows of the 1970s. That particular attack, the Jacobini, derives its name from a baseball comic called Astro Team. And one reason for these kind of attacks, which derive really from professional wrestling, was in simplifying and ritualizing the drama. But it also allowed animators to make use of banked animation, which is to say they could have a series of pre-animated moves and actions which they could then recycle from episode to episode. And on the Gunbuster Perfect Guide DVD, there's an interview with Hideaki Anno in which he laments the fact that although Gunbuster was conceived in homage to many of these shows, because the whole thing was made from scratch, it didn't actually have any banked animation to call on, so they had to make it all anew anyway. Just another word, by the way, about that Gundam event I mentioned. It was regarded by many in fandom as a pivotal moment in history, a moment when the generation that had been born since Astro Boy in '63 essentially grew up and began to take control of the science fiction world for themselves. Several members of what would become Gainax were present in the crowd, as Yoshiyuki Tomino, the creator of Gundam, announced what he called a declaration of a new century, in Japanese Shin Seiki Sengon. And some of you may have already noticed the intentional harmony with the idea of a gospel of a new century, which some might conjugate as Shin Seiki Evangelion. The members of Gainax and fans like them would form a powerful bloc at Japanese science fiction conventions in the early 1980s, essentially crowding out the old guard and bringing a stronger concentration on media, including anime and manga, rather than prose fiction. And ultimately their fan connections would lead to industry connections, and the formation of Gainax as an actual production company, firstly to make Wings of Oniamis, and then Gunbuster, which is where we came in. So in this sequence, Noriko is confronted for the first time with the sight of one of the alien creatures that humanity is at war with, and I will observe that Big Sister says very little in this scene, one way or the other. Most importantly, she doesn't say that she's never seen an alien before, thereby not contradicting the story about her first battle that will be included in the Gunbuster prequel novel. And this episode also introduces, for the first time I think, the issue of time dilation, which is going to play an increasingly important part in the rest of the show. And here we see it merely from a child's perspective, in which Noriko doesn't really understand why her dad is away for so long, but somehow makes it home in time for her birthdays. The Gunbuster collection book has a very interesting aside here, where it observes that this episode is the end of Noriko's childhood. In other words, this is where she is confronted by and lays to rest the fate of her father. But also she puts away a lot of childish things. I say a lot of because part of the subtext of this series is that Noriko enters a sort of moratorium on adulthood. She develops a sense of duty and responsibility and works hard, but she's going to remain a teenager for the next 12,000 years on screen, and that will also become an increasingly important element of the show. We reach the midpoint of this episode with the girls being found out by the security lasers, and I will just observe that when you get that little bumper and the chorus singing Gunbuster, those voices are all the voice of Kohei Tanaka, the composer, who recorded himself and then overdubbed it multiple times until he sounded like a bunch of different people. He actually went on to become a singer, so I think this may even be the first kind of time you get to hear Kohei Tanaka singing. I will observe, just in case any of you haven't, that the scene in which Coach chews out the girls about their insubordination is shot in a basketball court, which is an unlikely thing to find in a rotating space station, and indeed that we have transmitted light streaming in through the windows as if we are back on Earth in the glare of the Okinawa sun. Anyway, another thing, unlikely thing to find in a space station is the Japanese bathhouse. Although if you remember that this is a repurposed NASA station, you may realise why it has a legacy portrait of Apollo 11 hanging up in it, apparently inspired by the work of Ralph McQuarrie. But of course, nobody's really looking at the Apollo 11 portrait because this scene is most famous for showing all the leading women naked. Rather controversially, in the British release, originally on video in the 1990s, there was some editing that actually trimmed out some of this nudity. Repeatedly in testimonies about the series, crew members described this scene as an obsession, literally kodowari, obsession, in Japanese, on the part of Hideaki Anno. So the issues here are firstly Anno's observation that boobs were all the same in anime, apparently, and that is not a reasonable reflection of reality. He wanted to see different kinds of boobs, but also he wanted to see them working properly. And this is the origin of something we've already seen in the opening credits, but is most obvious here with the wondrous wobble we get from Jung Freud, which has come to be known as the Gainax bounce, or in animation terms, realistic breast dynamics. And in the book Gainax Interviews, Shinji Higuchi, who was supposed to be storyboarding this episode, complains that Hideaki Anno's memos and the flowchart that he drew of all the necessary shots in this scene became so convoluted and specific that they ended up trumping the storyboards themselves, which were originally just the girls sitting in the bath chatting. And we should probably talk more about fan service and the so-called male gaze in anime at a later point, but after that very brief interlude, which frankly serves to dispel any idea that Jung Freud is a bad girl and to make her one of the allies of the cast, we go straight to the mission and jeopardy in this episode, which is the sudden arrival of an unidentified object intersecting the orbit of Neptune at 99.8% light speed. Amid all this conversation about how to observe the unknown object, Coach ends up saying, "We have to see it with the naked eye." But in Japanese there's a lovely construction there, nikugan, literally the meat eye. Naked eye is weird enough in English as a phrase, but meat eye certainly takes it creepily further. And this, if I'm not mistaken, is also the first time in the show that we hear anyone talk about the elephant in the room, which is the secret Gunbuster project for which the leading ladies in this story are being secretly groomed. On which note, I realise now that last episode I forgot to talk about the voice actress who plays Big Sister, whose name is Rei Sakuma. She was a relatively young arrival in the anime field at the time this was made, and she'd had roles in Little Women and Zeta Gundam, but right then, around the time she appeared in Gunbuster, she also snagged a recurring role as Batako-san in the children's cartoon Anpan Man, which has basically kept her busy for the following 3 decades. Not long after recording this work, she also appeared as Gigi, the talking cat in Kiki's Delivery Service, a role that famously went to Phil Hartman in the English language dub, but she was the Japanese original. And she keeps very busy in anime, but surprisingly little voice work dubbing Hollywood films, just a few relatively minor roles in a few relatively minor films, which is surprising because you find with a lot of heavy-hitting Japanese voice actors, they practically adopt certain Hollywood celebrities and do all their work. But in the case of Sakuma, she has a lot of other strings to her bow, including a bunch of music CDs and a singing career that seemed to begin around the time she played Shampoo in Ranma Half. Anyway, Coach warns the girls his recovery ship is only going to be a minute or so behind them, but that literally months will pass on Earth owing to time dilation, and he offhandedly says, "Watch out you don't turn into Urashima Taro." Now, I haven't seen the finalised subtitles for this edition yet, so I don't know what the translators are going to do with it. Earlier translations of Gunbuster have often gone with the Rip Van Winkle effect, because it's a similar story, but Urashima Taro is a very Japanese variant of the story and worth going into. So, the story of Urashima Taro dates from the Middle Ages and is about a fisherman who rescues a turtle who thanks him by letting him ride on its back to the bottom of the sea, where he spends several days as a guest at the palace of the Dragon King, whose princess daughter, it turns out, was the turtle that he'd rescued. And after a few days, he says he wants to go back to his fishing village and see his ageing mother, so she lets him go, and she gives him a treasure box that he must never open. Well, what could possibly go wrong? When he goes back to the surface, he doesn't recognise anyone or anything, because in fact 300 years have passed on Earth. He opens the box, of course, and all the years rush out of it and turn him into an old man. And by the 1930s, Urashima Taro had been included as one of a dozen or so stories included in the National Curriculum Schools Reader, which meant not only that everybody knew it, but in post-war Japan, it stayed on the curriculum because it was one of few stories from before the war that weren't militaristic in nature. Actually, in the very earliest versions of the tale from the 9th century or so, he's not even a man, he's a boy, and it's called Urashima no Ko, the child of Urashima. And so it becomes a story more about a child who never gets to be an adult, but jumps straight from being very young to being very old. And in fact, there is a shrine on the coast of Japan which claims to represent the original version of the story, a man who in 5th century AD left Japan and went to the land of the immortals, not returning until 300 years later. I should say as well that by now you've probably worked out that pretty much every vehicle you see on screen is going to have some sort of pop culture connection, and the ones on this rescue mission are no exception. The Jupiter-class rocket that the girls cannibalise for their boosters is a reference to the vessel in the TV show Captain Ultra, and the design of the pickup vessel that Coach is piloting is a little homage to Satoru Ozawa's Blue Submarine No. 6, which itself would be the subject of a really good, very underrated anime serial some years later in 2000, directed by Mahiro Maeda, who himself worked on Gunbuster. I just want to point out at this point that we are nearly a third of the way through the story so far, and the only monster we have seen is a dead one, and we have not actually seen the titular Gunbuster yet. There was already a little bit of pressure from the producers by this point, suggesting that maybe they would like to get on with it, but I think we have a real triumph of pacing here, in that the concentration is very much on building the skill sets of the characters, and also possibly a format-based issue, in that we can be sure to lure people back for episode 3 now that we have them in suspense. And there have been considerable leaps in the timeline already. The girls leave the asteroid belt to go on this mission, so they would have had to get there first, but in the PlayStation 2 game, which interpolates these episodes with new episodes, episodes 1 and 2 are the same in both versions. There is, however, a huge gap on the PS2 between the end of this episode and the start of the next. Episode 3 of the video series is actually episode 9 of the PlayStation version, and episode 4 of the video series is episode 14 in the PlayStation version. But of course the missions that come in between them are largely fillers and combat diversions and so on, and not necessarily anything you really need to know about. There's one about Mars, there's one about a neutron star, there's one about the launch of the Excellion, that sort of thing. But here at the 20-minute mark, Noriko pulls aside the door and is confronted not by a presence but by an absence. Her father has been dead for the last 2 days, or the last few years, depending on the position of the observer in relation to the light-speed vessel. And there's a lot of what appears to be wind resistance or buffeting going on, and the get-out clause with that is that we're dealing with the as-yet undiscovered physics to do with the ether of space, which generates phenomena not unlike wind. And that's been an issue in much science fiction for the last couple of generations, because realistic space combat and space scenes would need to be entirely silent if shot realistically, and distances are often hard to gauge, and combat is likely to be at a very long distance. And various science fiction authors have tried to find a way around that. Harlan Ellison, I think, suggested that you might say that vehicles in Star Wars have energy fields that create distortion on their radios, and that generates fake noise when they get close to one another. And Yoshiyuki Tomino proposed Minovsky particles, which for some reason inhibit space combat and force humanity to climb inside giant robots to fight each other, which is how Gundam justifies its toys. Before anyone complains, by the way, I know they're not robots, I know they're mecha. Technically a robot would be autonomous, and the vehicles in this show and many others are in fact piloted. I say giant robot because at heart I, and most of the people making this anime, am still 8 years old and barely see the difference. Repeated use here, of course, of the emergency lighting, which switches in Gunbuster between red and blue, which is of course the colour of emergency lighting in the real world as well. Red being easier to spot during the day, blue easier to spot at night, so many emergency vehicles switch between the two as a matter of course. That rolling timpani is the opening bars of the Gunbuster March, which was the first piece of music that Kohei Tanaka wrote for this. It's repeated on multiple occasions, and there's also a version with lyrics, the March of Excellion, which I don't think appears in the show proper, but was included on the soundtrack album, and is a loving homage to Japanese wartime propaganda songs, all about how it is the duty of the Excellion to defend the human race from its enemies for the honour of one's father and mother. And the girls are back in the nick of time to be aboard the Excellion on its inaugural voyage. The scale being as hard to determine in space as it is, I should probably let you know that the Excellion is 7.2 kilometres long. That's about 4.5 miles, or 3 times as long as the average Star Destroyer in Star Wars, so naturally they have plenty of open space, like this conference hall, and as it turns out in the next episode, even an internal train. So anyway, that's episode 2 of Gunbuster, an episode that is topped and tailed by memories of Noriko's father, the man who inspires her to go into space, and whose death inspires her search for revenge. He was played, by the way, by Masashi Hirose, Gundam's Ramba Ral, whose more recent roles included a stint providing the voice of Stan Lee in all the cameos in the early Marvel Universe films, from the Avengers through to Guardians of the Galaxy. Don't ask me why. It's only now, by the way, when I see the credits of this episode, I see a couple of telltale names on there. The lead animator on this was Yuji Moriyama. That much I know, but I see in this episode the names of Satoshi Urashihara and Kinji Yoshimoto credited with key animation assistants. And if you're a fan of 1990s anime, you will know that them as the creators of the video Plastic Little, which was notorious for its mastery of realistic breast dynamics and luscious flesh tones, for indeed a scene in which all the female characters climbed into a bath. What are the odds that they had something of a hand in this episode's bath scene as well? If you look at the credits for this episode as well, you'll see the name Noriko Takaya, after whom the character of Noriko was named, responsible for the cell harmonies in this episode. Her name is harder to spot for non-linguists because the real Noriko Takaya writes her name in kanji, whereas the anime version uses far more readable katakana. Ending titles here also credited to Kimiko Akai, the married name of the inspiration for this anime's Kimiko Higuchi. Also, I noticed the company listed as Kaze Animation, but I realised from my researches into the Chinese animation business that should actually be read as Feng Animation, because some of the backgrounds, at least in this episode, were done in China. Anyway, I shall be back in the next episode, First Love, First Sortie, to talk about the most unlikely anime character ever to be based on a real person, Smith Torin. Bye for now.
地球を離れて1万パーセクの星空で女子恒例の肝試し大会。でもコーチに見つかって大目玉。罰当番はレーザー砲のレンズ磨きなの。腰が痛い。そこで知り合ったちょっと素敵な男の子。合戦運の下でいいムードと思ったら、突然の敵襲、初めての実戦。一撃必殺のカリフォルニウム核爆弾。神様、はしたないのりこをお許しください。次回トップを狙え第3話、初めてのときめき、初めての出撃に稲妻キック。